in some of these things meaningful. Let me just go ahead and kind of tell you what to expect as you're out there sharing the gospel. People will have objections. And I'm going to go ahead and give them a lot of credit here, too. They probably should be critical thinkers, big life decisions, and big truth claim statements that they're hearing, right? If I came and told you that Islam is true, and Allah is true, and the Quran is true, would you just take it at face value because I told you it? It would require a whole lot of evidence for you to change your worldview. Think about it this way. All of us go through life forming our worldview, forming our understanding of of who created us, what our purpose is here, how the world operates, what we're in Florida, right? Who doesn't own a pair of sunglasses in Florida, right? You ever put on what happened? All of us go through life and see the world in a certain way to take it with. And so it's only right, if you think about it, that people engage in this conversation. You're sharing the gospel with them, and it's going to butt up against their existing worldviews, their existing way of viewing what's true and how the world works. And so this is where apologetics comes in. You have the opportunity to help them to overcome those, to see the truth, instead of those being obstacles to the gospel. We're going to be talking about several different topics for the next several weeks. Today and next week, we're going to be talking about the Bible. How do we know that it's the Bible? We're going to be talking about how do we know that God exists. Well, we can certainly know that God exists in many ways that if you walk with the Lord, you've experienced this, right? You've seen him working in your life. There's something maybe it's hard to explain. You've seen answers to prayer. But we're going to be able to take a look at God's engagement with his creation and the evidence that God, by his grace, has left behind. We're going to deal with issues like the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. God is all good and all powerful. Why do bad things happen to us? Why does real suffering actually exist? That's actually the number one objection that gets raised against God, either his existence or his goodness. We're going to talk about it. We're going to take a look at the resurrection. In fact, we're going to be doing that really close to Easter time. You know, when we're celebrating Easter, we are celebrating a man who was dead who raised to new life. But here's the reality: for everybody's lived experience, right? Dead people tend to stay dead. So we're making a pretty bold truth claim when we say that Jesus rose from the dead. Is there evidence? Well, yes. It happened in time and space in human history. There were witnesses. There's records. Yes. And so we're going to take a look at that. And my hope as we journey together is that it's going to bolster your own faith. It might answer some of those intellectual doubts you might have. And it's going to give you tools in your tool belt to be able to share the gospel and overcome some of those objections that others have. I'm going to go ahead and let you know that questions are always allowed. I have to limit rabbit trails because out of respect for the time. Please feel free to raise your hand at any point and ask a question, especially if it's clarifying something I said. Today we're going to talk about the Bible. Is the Bible reliable? You might have heard some objections as there's so many errors in the Bible, or the Bible's not relevant anymore, or the Bible, the books of the Bible were written, a long time after the events that they record. How can they be trustworthy? So we're going to take a look at some of the evidence for the reliability of the Bible together today. So forgive me for the small text on the screen. I want to qualify our journey together this particular evening What do we mean by the Bible? And I want to make sure we understand this. Who's got your Bible with you? I'm guilty of having forgotten mine in the car. Raise your Bible up. Okay, very good. You're all more faithful Christians than I am. You brought them to church. Good job. But what do we mean by the Bible? What translations do you all have? Call them out. Wow, I probably shouldn't have. Yes, I heard them all. It was great. No, if I were to guess or have you do it individually, I'm sure we had a couple different translations. There could be some differences between your Bibles. What are we talking about when we say the Bible? Right? We're going to take a look at, first of all, God's faithfulness and the reliability of the Bible through its various stages. So here's what I mean by that. The original writings, autographs, the actual Matthew took, pen to paper, and this was the product. And then clearly we aren't just passing around the original scroll, right? Copies were made. So we need to know, first of all, are the original writings reliable? We need to know, okay, what about the process of copying it down through history, right? The preservation of those copies. And then the translations we have, because who knows what language the Old Testament was written in? Hebrew. What language is the New Testament written in? Greek. How many of you read Hebrew or Greek? Good. Mike didn't raise his hand. I was surprised. So how do we know that our translations are accurate? So we're going to touch on that together today, too. Here's a caveat for our journey today. We're going to be focusing on the New Testament. Okay. That doesn't mean it's not derogatory toward the Old Testament. And here's what we're going to see at the end of our presentation today, that the New Testament so thoroughly affirms the Old Testament that if we've proven the reliability of the New Testament, the Old Testament follows. We'll see some evidence too, but most of our time together is going to be spent on the New Testament. So let's start with the original writings. So here's the first question we need to ask is how long after the events were they written? So we're going to take a look at several of the books, but I need some helpers here with me. Who's a volunteer? A brave volunteer, because I'm not going to tell you what you're doing. I actually need several, so don't make me call on you. All right, brave volunteers, come on down. If I have 20, that might be too much, but let's see here. I'm going to need, hey, Jordan. All right. Let's see. I'm going to, no. You're going to do me a favor and hold this out so everybody can see it. You can stand right over here. All right. And you are going to hold this and stand over here. All right. I need a couple more volunteers. I need exactly 4 more volunteers. All right. Come on down. All right. Thank you. You're going to stand right here next to Jordan. You're going to stand right here. Thank you so much. You're going to stand right here. And, oh, we got one more coming? Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. All right. We're going to take this. And you are going to stand right over here. I'm going to go sit down. All right. So what are we looking at here? So first of all, we live in a time that is unprecedented in history, right? Something happens, and 3 seconds later, it's on YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Discord, whatever your social media channel is. It's broadcast all the way around the world. We know things in an instant, right? We live in a very different culture than anywhere else at any other time in all of human history. So when you see these years, you might start to think, oh my goodness, that's such a long period of time. But it's actually really not, especially compared to the time frame between events and the writings that report on such events from other ancient sources. So we're going to take a look at what that means. But here's what I want you to understand. So if you, the dates are up there. We have them represented here in how many years from the cross. All right, so Michelle's got the cross. So that is when Jesus died. So here's the question. How long after were the various books of the Bible written? And we're not going through all the New Testament books. We'll do a good sample, starting with the Gospels. So we've got Jordan here, and she has plus 65. I want to pause for a second, and I just want to preface it. There is so much evidence for the writings of the Gospels, in fact, just about all the New Testament books, to have been completed prior to 70 AD, prior to the destruction of the temple. John would have been a little later. But there's good arguments for them being earlier. So why do I have these dates? These are what critical New Testament scholars use as dates. What do I mean by critical New Testament scholars? Those who have degrees of New Testament history, they fall all the way along the spectrum from atheist to conservative Christian. And their discipline, they are approaching the New Testament as an academic subject. They're leaving faith at their door. They're trying to not have biases, although everybody has biases. But these are the dates that they give. So for John, it would be AD 95. And so if we're using a date of 30 for Jesus' crucifixion, then John was written 65 years after that. Okay? Luke, only 55 years after that. Matthew, 50. Mark, 40. 1 Corinthians, only 25 years after the events. So if we had nothing else, okay, these are very good dates. Now, Jordan and some of our teenagers may not be able to answer this question well, but raise your hand if you can remember significant events in detail that happened 25 years ago. Raise your hand. Wow. Some of you had to really think about that. 25 years ago. I can even think of things from 25 years ago. So, all right. And so here's the thing, especially significant, big things that happen, like your Lord and Savior you have followed for numerous years, being arrested, crucified, seeing him risen from the dead, seeing his miracles, hearing his teaching that was unlike anything that you've seen before, so much so that the whole life and trajectory of your life changed after. This is what we're talking about. We're not talking about what you ate 25 years ago. We're talking about earth-shattering, world and life-changing events. And remember, we know that the Holy Spirit used superintended this so that they kept accurate records, but that's what Mike's going to be talking about next week. But when we're talking to people who don't believe in inspiration, we're talking to people who don't believe the Bible comes from God, we have very accurate records in terms of time. I'm going to show you by comparison. All right, you all have been wonderful. I'm going to call you up again in a minute. So you're going to take these with you, and we're going to see if you can remember where you were in time when you come back. So here's something I want to just share with you. Again, I know that if you're hearing this for the first time, if you don't have familiarity with ancient sources, that some of those, especially John, right, and Luke, can seem kind of late. Is it reliable? Well, here's what people who have studied ancient literature have to say. From what we know about the reliability patterns of orally transmitted traditions, this actually is a rather insignificant span of time. One that, technically speaking, puts us in touch with oral history rather than oral tradition per se. A broad range of studies, from ancient Greece to 19th century Serbo-Croatia to contemporary Africa, have all confirmed that orally oriented historical traditions, both oral, right, passing on orally, and written, like the New Testament manuscripts, of relatively recent events within roughly 80 to 150 years of the event reported tend to be quite reliable. Now, I want you to look at that 80 to 150 years. So they're saying that sources that are written 80 to 150 years after an event are quite reliable. So tell me, what does that say to you compared to the dates you saw here at the gospel? Very reliable, or what did you say? Yeah, it's more reliable, right? The New Testament documents are far more reliable than other ancient manuscripts that are considered quite reliable by experts in the field. And so we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the early writing, the early sources for the things that we believe in Christianity. But here's some other things, right? We have the Gospels, and I gave you First Corinthians, but even before we had those particular texts, we had Christian oral tradition and writings that go all the way back to the death of Jesus on the cross. So it's the earliest time in church history, post-death and resurrection of Jesus. So I want you to see here, we had First Corinthians up here. First Corinthians was written between 54 and 55 AD. Okay? And in that, who has a Bible? Who was one of those faithful ones that had a Bible? Come on up here. Somebody who doesn't mind reading God's word because they're proud of it. Come on up. All right, we have one of them, faithful brother who's going to read the 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Yes, verses 3 through 8. So as he's turning there, I'm going to set this up. Paul is writing to a church that he himself planted and spent a good period of time there, sharing the gospel, making disciples, establishing the leadership, and he's reminding them in this text about when he was first there preaching the gospel. Verses 3 through 8.
For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, as the one of known within.
Thank you so much. All right. So I left out one thing. See, I made a mistake. Mike won't make mistakes, but I made it. That was a relevant passage. I'm going to show you why in just a minute. So Paul writes in AD 54 to 55, the letter 1 Corinthians. He's reminding them in the two verses I didn't ask my friend here to read. At the very beginning of that passage, he's reminding them of the gospel. Okay? And he says, I'm reminding you of the gospel I preached to you and in which you placed your faith. Right? And if you want to remain in this, you have to stand firm. He goes on to explain the gospel. Jesus died for sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried, that he rose again, and we saw that. Okay? So he's reminding them about 5 years earlier, he was in Corinth proclaiming the gospel. So what he's saying here actually comes back to 50 when he first proclaimed it. But that's not the first place that Paul heard it. He didn't make it up. He didn't just hear it and pass it on in AD 50. In fact, verses 3 through 8, that creed, James D.G. Dunn and other New Testament scholars argued that creed and others that put the gospel in a form that's easily repeatable, recitable, something they'd say together, something they'd pass on, something they'd be able to articulate easily as they're telling people about Jesus and about salvation, actually dates all the way back to the year 30 or 31. So within months of Jesus' death on the cross, the gospel is already being proclaimed in the same way it is through our New Testament writings and the same way it is all the way down to us. There's no room for legendary development or changing of the Christian faith. It has been the same ever since. The high view of Jesus as Lord, the roles of salvation, all the things that we affirm were affirmed from the earliest places since the church formed, since Jesus' death and resurrection, the birth of the church. Here's something I'm going to have for you in coming weeks. Is something I actually just had an article published. I didn't say that to pat myself on the back, but because it's all about this idea of gospel sources. Somebody else with a Bible. I'm going to get you involved, by the way. I am not ashamed of getting you involved. If you would read for me, my friend, Luke chapter 1, and we'll do the first first 4 verses. Luke chapter.
This is the NASB. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses of the word have handed them down to us, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know the exact truth about the things you have been taught.
Dr. Luke, that's right. And Dr. Luke was great at research, and Dr. Luke told you that in his first 4 verses. So here's what Luke said, is that other people have written an account of these things. Well, what things? The thing he's about to write the account of. He wrote his gospel of Jesus' life, of Jesus' teachings, of Jesus' miracles, of Jesus' death and resurrection. And he wasn't the first to do it. In fact, he says many have written of these things. And him, being the diligent researcher he is, went and investigated these things, reading the sources, talking to the eyewitnesses before first writing his. So it's easy for us to just say, well, look, Luke was written in this year, right? But Luke is gathering sources that were here throughout this entire thing, including writings, earlier gospels and things. Think about this. If you were the leader of the church, if you were Peter or James, and the gospel is going forth, the churches are being planted, and you wanted to make sure that you had accurate teaching about Jesus' life and ministry and the teachings of the apostles, how best to do that? Provide written sources for the churches to be disseminated. Now, do we have copies of these now? No. We know about it, right? But those were just not the documents that God chose to preserve in those early forms for the church for all of history. But we do see that incorporated in our Gospels, in our New Testament writings, are parts of those things, citations of those things, portions of those things, oral tradition that was included in our scriptures, and they date right back from the beginning. So not only do we have early sources, but we have early sources, and the sources behind our sources are also early. Now let's look at I am going to ask. I'm only gonna ask 2 of you. I'm gonna ask Michelle to come back up and Jordan to come back. But I need some new volunteers. I'm getting you all involved. Nobody's coming back next week. Mike, you have no pressure at all. All right. Very good. Thank you, Joe. You're a good sport. I appreciate it. All right. Thank you. All right. That's perfect. I needed 2 volunteers, and I got them. All right. What's your name? Chloe. Nice to meet you. What's your name? Jeremiah. Nice to meet you. Appreciate you both helping me out today. All right. So, Chloe, Jeremiah, let's take a look here. We've got the cross, and then we've got how many years? 65 years, if we believe the critical scholars' dates for the Gospel of John. Well, how does that compare? Remember, this is the latest Gospel. All the other ones were earlier, and the sources were even earlier. So how about other people we like? Oh, I studied that in history class. That's just, the things they talk about him. That's just fact. We never questioned it. Our professors never questioned it, right? How about Alexander the Great? Raise your hand if you've heard of Alexander the Great. Yeah, first, he went on a tear. By the time he was 33, he owned the whole world. My goodness, they able to unite, which really means conquer and bring under his umbrella, all of Greece and march onward to conquer all these other people groups. We've all heard of Alexander the Great. So you're going to stand right next to Michelle because we're going to, well, this is 0.0 for John. This is going to be 0.0 for Alexander. Where do you think you're going to stand? You probably saw it right through the paper, right? So we use a Sharpie on thin paper. Fine. All right, hold this up. plus 425 years. Well, that's 65 years. You got to keep going, buddy. No, no, no. We got to, man, all right. Oh, yeah. Go stand outside. No, I'm just kidding. You're good right here. All right. Do you see a difference? How many people are always questioning the reliability of our biblical sources, even when the latest one that is according to critical scholars dates, all right, is only plus 65, but nobody doubts Alexander the Great. The best sources for him, Arian and Plutarch, plus 425 years. All right, come back over here. Let's try another example. Because, who knows? Maybe Alexander was the only one like that. Good sport. I got you walking all over the place. All right, we're going to also need 2 more volunteers. So I'm going to sit here for an hour. Come on now. All right, you're now going to be holding Tiberius. All right, very good. Why don't you stand right here till I tell you where we're standing. But what's your name? No, nice to meet you. Good. Nice to meet you. All right, so Tiberius. Who's Tiberius? Does anybody know? Caesar, right? Yeah. I don't have my little clicker thing. That would have been on my next slide. Yes. So he was the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, right? Ooh, thank you. All right. You got me back there, Ben? Thanks. All right. So here's, I already put the best sources on it. Don't look at the dates. Pretend you don't see that. This is more fun. All right. So if Tiberius is here, 0. How about this? We go Tacitus. You're going to hold Tacitus. And where do you think you're going to be? All right. So Tacitus, who's one of the better sources for Tiberius. You got it right there. You're good. Perfect. The people got to go even farther than you. Suetonius, you're going to go stand on the other side of her. And then oh, yeah, you're going to help me with that. Cassius, and I got to do it to you again because there's a big difference between 85 years and 180 years. So go stand over there. It's nothing personal. All right. I like to read about Roman history, ancient Rome. I know I'm a nerd. I'm a self-professed nerd. It's okay. I read books on these things, and the original sources, man, it blows me away when you think about how late they are. The Gospel of John, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, 1 Corinthians, and all the other texts in between that are closer, and the sources that are even earlier, even right here, really close to the time. Thank you guys. You all have been wonderful. I appreciate it. You can keep that as a souvenir. God bless you. Thank you. Because it's the cross, I'll hold on to this. We have good sources. All right, I'm going to have to start moving a lot faster because I was a little overzealous in putting together the material for tonight. I'm borrowing this. I will give you the source because if you are interested in apologetics, either more information on what we're talking about today or digging in deeper, this is a great introduction to apologetics. In fact, I told you that I went to a family camp and heard from Dr. Geisler 12 steps that prove that Christianity is true. That is outlined in this book. There's no paper, write it down. You don't have enough faith to be an atheist by Geisler and Turek. It'll be up here for you to look at and write down later. Please don't walk off with it, right? So here's what they say. How do we know what was written in those texts, in those early texts? How do we know that's even authentic? How do we know that what they wrote is true, in other words? All right, well, here's just some of the things. First, they made no attempt to harmonize their accounts. If you have read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you know there's some differences. Not contradictions, but some things that are a little difficult to explain or that are spelled out a little different or different areas that were highlighted or like how many women were at the tomb. Was it one? Was it two? Was it many? Well, one writer chose to mention one by name, one a few by name, one just so there's different things. But if they were trying to make sure that they could pass these 4 gospels off under the radar without criticism, don't you think they would have gotten their heads together and cleaned up some of that stuff? They included details that put Jesus in a bad light, right? I mean, there's numerous of them, but it's where Lazarus was going to die. Who let him? He wouldn't raise him later. Jesus is credit, but but there's lots of different things that it painted Jesus in an interesting way that could have been smoother for audiences, more palatable if they had just done things a little bit. They left many difficult passages in their text. Um, things like Jesus saying, "You have to eat my body and drink my blood," and literally people walked away at that point. That was just a hard teaching. Well, why'd they leave it in there? They could have just cleaned it up for their readers. They didn't walk away like those people standing there in that particular instance. They retained many self-incriminating details. I am sorry, but if you are really Peter's friend and you are making this up, when Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," I think you would have done a brother a favor and not put that in there. Because that's just bad. How about this? Be a little fake. How many times did Jesus say that to them? Do you think they would have included the part where they fell asleep? Multiple times on the night Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. If you are making this up, it is a fiction. Wouldn't you make yourself look a little better, especially if you plan on being the leader of the church? They included many demanding sayings of Jesus. And a little faster. They distinguished their words from Jesus' words. They did not deny their testimony under threat of death. I'm going to go one further than Dr. Geisler. Many of them did die for their testimony. Many of them did die. And because they would not recant, because it's not a fiction. This is the truth. They claimed their record was based on eyewitnesses. They had women witnessing the resurrection before men. We're going to talk more about this when we look at the evidence for the resurrection. But in that particular day and time, women were not even allowed to testify in court. A woman's testimony meant nothing. It actually hurt their case to put on in writing that the women were the ones to first believe that Jesus had risen, first seen the angel, first seen the risen Jesus. The fact that they included that, it has to be true. They gained nothing by including it. In fact, it hurt their case. The only reason to include it is if it was the truth. They challenge their readers to check out the facts. In fact, even John, the latest gospel, says he's writing these things so that they would know the truth of these things. There was that accessibility to the places they mentioned, the people they mentioned, to check it out. They discarded long-held Jewish beliefs overnight. I mean, when you think about some of the things they did, mixing with Gentiles, eating, food that was eating non-kosher food. Yeah, I mean, just so many different things. Overnight, things just change. And they include more than 30 historical people, name-dropped people who, remember these early documents, when they were being disseminated. If that were not true, it would have been. So here's accusations that Bart Ehrman and other critical scholars will say is that we don't know who wrote that. But yet there's never been a change of course. There's never been a difference of opinion in the church since the earliest times. The tradition that was handed from the very first to now has always been the understanding that Matthew and John were written by Matthew and John. We have early source, Papias, who's included in Eusebius's church history in the 4th century. He claims that Matthew was written by Matthew and that Mark was written by Mark, who was a disciple of Peter who received first-hand information from Peter. And so this is a 1st century into the 2nd century source, right? So early. Luke himself claims, we just read this earlier, Luke himself claims to have researched the written and oral accounts of Jesus' life in preparation for writing his own gospel. So Luke was not an apostle, right? He He didn't travel with Jesus, etc., but he went back to the sources. He had access to those who did, and to their writings, and included them in his gospel. So we have all these great reasons to trust what we find in the New Testament. As far as authorship of Matthew and John, this is one of those critical scholars. James B.G. Dunn just passed away within the last 2 years. Here's what he said. To be sure, 2 of the 4 canonical Gospels have traditionally been attributed to 2 of the 12, Matthew and John, and the claim deserves respect. Now, if I were to say the claim deserves respect, you don't have to listen to me. But somebody who's an expert in this field, who has done the research, who knows, who writes and is respected, when he says the claim deserves respect, then it deserves respect. And here's the other thing. Do we only hear about these things in the New Testament, or do we have things outside the New Testament that correspond with, affirm the things we read in the New Testament? Yeah, we have plenty. Historians, Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thales, Phlegon, government officials like Pliny the Younger, Emperor Trajan, Emperor Hadrian, these are all people who wrote and included things that are affirmed, or that affirm things we see in the New Testament. Other sources, including the Jewish Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, has things about Jesus in it, and the Greek writer Lucian. And here are the things that we see affirmed. So these are things in the New Testament that outside sources, non-Christian sources, if we just read those, these are things we can discern about Jesus from. Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. He lived a virtuous life. He was a wonder worker, a miracle worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. An eclipse and earthquake occurred when he died. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. His disciples were willing to die for their belief. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome. His disciples denied the Roman gods, by the way, to their death, and worshiped Jesus as God. Friends, you might say, yeah, I know all those things. It says it in the Bible. Yeah, but every one of these facts you can find outside the Bible in Jewish, Roman sources. This is what the New Testament says, and others haven't. All right. Let's talk briefly about copies. So let's just say, all right, fine. The New Testament was written reliably. That was 2,000 years ago. How do I know what I have now, that I picked up at Barnes & Noble or ordered off of Amazon, is the same thing that they wrote, right? Well, here's what we want to take a look at here. First of all of history comes from sources, right? Every bit of historical study we do comes from sources, and we would hope they're as close to the time as possible, right? And so we're going to take a look at 2 different criteria that historians look at to determine and the copies that have survived through history, okay? And how many copies do we have? Why are these 2 questions important? Here's the first one, right? For the time gap of years. If something was written in AD 50, and the earliest copy that we have is from 500 AD, we have nothing in between. How do we know the copy that we have from 500? Right? So what if something was originally written in 50 and we have something in 75? In a time period where the people who would have read it or the eyewitnesses are still there, right? So early is always better. How does the New Testament stack up? Well, you already see the chart. Homer, I had to read this in 8th grade English. With the Iliad and the Odyssey, you learn a lot about Greek history and Greek mythology and all that from Homer. The earliest surviving copy is dated 400 years after Homer's original life. Demosthenes, Herodotus, these are places where we get history from. Plato, a philosopher. In fact, we wouldn't even know Socrates if not from Plato. Tacitus, uh, Roman official, writer of history, wrote things to the emperor that we have copies of. Caesar, that's Julius Caesar. You know, we could read. He had a lot of people write about him, but he wrote a lot too, including his conquests and stuff. And the earliest surviving copy, we know when he lived, we know what he must have written. The earliest copy we have is 1,000 years after. Printing 750. You see it all. Look at the top. What's the earliest surviving copy of the New Testament that we have, or New Testament manuscript that we have after the first writing? 25 years. Here's the other thing. Not only is it early, and I mean so much earlier than the other things that no history professors questions, really, right? We don't go through class taking history. No, it's on the test because we can count it as true. How about number of copies? Why is number of copies important? If you had 3 copies of something, and all 3 of them were different at some point, how do you know which one's true? If you had 3 copies of something, you read through them all, and there's a change between all 3 of them, how on earth do you know? What if you had 1,000 of them? And there's something different in 40 of them, but all the rest of them say something else. Would you know which one was more accurate? Yeah. You'd have the standard. This is clearly somewhere where they deviated, they messed up, they changed something, whatever it is, they fell asleep while they were copying the scroll. And here we have all of this other, all these other copies to compare it to. So it's important. Look at Pliny down at the bottom. Only 7 copies. Same for Plato. All right, Herodotus is only one better at 8. Do you think there were not differences between those copies? Of course there were. We have scholars making their best guess. What about the New Testament? Somewhere about 5,600 is the more conservative answer. 5,600 plus early Greek New Testament. So was there a scribe somewhere who, caught a word on one line and then, blinked for a second and found that same word on another line and messed up his copy of that particular page? Sure. Do we know what the error is? Sure. We have 5,599 other copies to compare it to. And so again, when it comes to the reliability of the New Testament, when we compare it to any other ancient literature from which we derive truth about the past, we have an embarrassment of riches in terms of the reliability of our Bible. All right, I'll talk just briefly about translations because I have 6 minutes and I'm determined to be on time. Talk about translations. Your translations are based on Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic texts that are the best that we have in terms of, remember we're comparing copies to copies, so the scholars have gone in and they've discerned from the embarrassment of riches what the original would have said, all right? And so they have Greek and Hebrew texts. Here's the thing, most of us don't read Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. So when you read your English or Spanish or whatever the translation you have of the Bible, 500 English Bible, it's based on somebody's translation from one language to another. There are words in Greek that don't exist in English or have a completely different meaning. There are words in English that weren't in Koine Greek 2,000 years ago that would have been written that way. So these scholars who are good at what they do have to make their best educated decisions. And they're balancing 2 things. Faithfulness to the text, to the original text, and our ability to comprehend it in our language, right? So here's what I would argue, here's what I would say. The originals, right, inerrant. The originals, right, inerrant. Our copies, wholly reliable, absolutely trusted. Our translations, a good idea. They're very faithful. And sometimes it's a good idea to get a good study tool from the Greek and Hebrew, or compare 2 different translations. So to talk with your pastor about what's a good translation that's faithful and understanding. And so a lot of the questions about the Bible's reliability, or look, this is different. Well, A lot of that comes down even to translation. So nothing to freak out about, but something to be educated. All right. So we've been focusing on the New Testament today. What about the Old Testament? I'm going to end with this. Hopefully, I'll stick around if there are questions. What about the Old Testament? Again, there's so much evidence for the reliability of the New Testament, right? The New Testament directly quotes the Old Testament 283 times. It implies it or references it more than that, but directly quotes it 283 times. Your biblical writers, right? And when they're writing down what Jesus said, right? The people we trust, they affirm the Old Testament 100%. In fact, Jesus affirmed the Old Testament many times and claimed that all the Old Testament pointed to him. We see that in Luke 24:27 and verse 44, two different occasions. The Dead Sea Scrolls and other archaeological finds demonstrate consistency in the Old Testament manuscripts as well. There's a lot of evidence for the reliability of the Old Testament. I do want to share two words about archaeology. Again, there's only so much time today. Archaeology has affirmed both the Old and New Testament. As we're talking about the Old Testament, I thought I'd include a few. This is from U.S. News and World Report. That is not a theological, not a Christian periodical. Here's what they have printed. In extraordinary ways, modern archaeology has affirmed the historical core of the Old and New Testaments, corroborating key portions of the stories. And how about an archaeologist, since we're talking about archaeology? Here's what Nelson Gluck, an archaeologist, has said. Has written, he said, as a matter of fact, however, it may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted the biblical reference. By contrast, scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements. And what's funny is if you study archaeology even a little bit, I'm a novice at that, that's not my field, but that's a fun hobby. If you look back through recent history, last 100 years, if you will, there's skeptics saying, that's not true, there's no archaeological discovery. And then archaeology finds it. Is the Bible reliable? I know I'm out of time. If there are any questions, Pastor Joe, can I allow for questions, or should I be around in front for anybody to have a back? Oh, there's plenty. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, I appreciate that. So yeah, that's a great question. So let me talk about it in two different ways. We talked about critical scholars, those who view the New Testament as just a subject to be studied. And what becomes very obvious as you're reading these texts is that the truth is glaring them in the face, and they're unwilling to see it. We talked earlier about worldviews, presuppositions, and sometimes belief in the Bible is just outside of their plausibility structure. They've got blinders on, and they don't want to see it, whether it's they don't believe in miracles, and the Bible talks about miracles, or anything like that. In terms of who we engage with regularly, a lot of times they don't have real reasons. They can't give you good articulated answers. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. No, it's true. But even as we share the gospel, though, now we're presenting them with a choice, and they're going to give us a little bit of pushback. But you raised an interesting question. What about people who believe something else? Think about Muslims who will tell you that the Quran says that Jesus did not die on the cross. He was taken by Allah. It was written 600 years after the time of Jesus. That's not a good historical source. What do the historical sources say? Oh, they're much. They show the truth of what we believe. So, yeah. Good question. Any other questions?
It's a full manuscript.
Yes.
It's not a piece of it.
Oh, you're talking about that was written at 55 AD.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole letter was written there. I read you a portion of it only because he pointed back to things in the writing. He pointed back to things he said earlier, so it would have been consistent with something Belief had said earlier. But yes, all of it was written in 55 AD, which is only 25 years after Jesus died.
So, and Pastor Joe, sorry. Now there's a which one did you say was a full? Like we don't have a New Testament full copy of the New Testament. You were saying something with the pieces.
It's not part of the autograph, the original writing. Sure, it could be. But if we have a copy from 95, then certainly that plus 65, that 95 is way earlier because it would have been a copy of something written earlier. Yeah, absolutely. And critical scholars say no, not Christians. Yeah, very good.
Oh, I was wondering if the 5800 included partial manuscripts as well as normal manuscripts, because I've heard historians say that we have more than 6,000 manuscripts, but I also was unclear when you found the information that you had put up, because the information is always changing. I know, so like, yeah, we're always finding more stuff, and lately I've heard we have more than 6,000, but I just didn't know what you're.
I don't know what the date they cut it off.
Okay, yeah, that's what I figured. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Critical scholars they don't think Revelation is authentic and it was written by somebody different later. So it's not usually going to come up in an apologetic kind of context. But as far as personal view, I think it's a lot earlier. I think both views are a lot earlier. Yeah. Well, yeah. So I will address that because that's an important part. But one of the big objections we often get is, well, somebody in power chose which books to include because there are other gospels. Well, the other gospels that are not the canonical gospels that are included in scriptures, scholars have the evidence is that they are much later, a century or more later. They're clear. This to form their agenda. There's no reason to accept theirs.